we hoisting the mizzen or battening down the hatches tomorrow? Blimey! I'll check the weather right now.
We interrupt this programming to bring you a special report. The storm brewing in the ocean right now is still brewing. Not only is it brewing, but it's heading towards Florida. It's heading towards Lake Okeechobee, Kissimmee, and Gainesville. So you better be prepared. It's crucial that you stock up on bottled water and food.
Alright, so I got food, but why do I have to buy bottled water?
So we're gonna go ahead and cut to our special reporter, who's gonna talk to us about why it's important to stock up on bottled water and food. Let's go ahead and cut.
I'm here with local celebrity Dee Hizzle. Tell me, Dee Hizzle, how are you preparing for this storm?
Well, being a celebrity and all, I have multiple houses, each one really expensive and nicer than the next. Each one supplied from a different water source, including from public facilities and a private well.
Okay, well both of those are really not that safe because with a hurricane, if there's too much flooding or if the winds are too high, it could cause the water treatment facility to shut down and leave you without clean drinking water.
But what about my private well?
Well, that's not safe either because flooding from hurricane can lead to your private well being contaminated with water with contaminants as well, and that causes health risks.
That's whack.
We now bring you to our chief environmental engineer to tell you about the impact that hurricanes have on our wetlands and in turn our water treatment plants.
Hurricane Andrew is putting Gainesville's groundwater at risk. The Sweetwater Wetlands Treatment Plant is responsible for moving 89% of nitrogen and 82% of phosphorus that comes through the Gainesville area runoff. That means that during a period of high flooding, that the wetland is not properly removing the amount of nutrients that it needs to before it goes to Alachua County sink. This puts the entire Gainesville area and everyone in the surrounding Alachua County area at risk for groundwater contamination. One way to prevent this would be to increase the area of our wetland so that way when the flow goes into this area, that the velocity through this treatment wetland isn't affected as much by this high load coming in during a hurricane event. Another way to help prevent unnecessary loading into the Alachua County sink would be to decrease the amount of impermeable concrete used in the Gainesville area. Our citizens could use permeable concrete so that way the flow going in during a major event isn't so much that it overloads the system, causing the groundwater and wastewater system to immediately be flushed into our groundwater. Gainesville is not the only area affected by this though. Most wastewater treatment plants are built in areas of low elevation, meaning that they're most affected during times of flooding. This means that when they get too high levels of water coming in, they cannot treat all the water that's being put into their system, meaning that it will go through and straight into the groundwater table. In Gainesville, we use the Sweetwater wetlands to process most of our wastewater that leaves the Gainesville area. Most of the water that falls over Gainesville's rainfall goes through a channel specifically to get dumped into the Sweetwater wetlands before it reaches the Alachua sink. Before it goes from the sink though, all these nutrients and contaminants that are in this runoff from the Gainesville area need to get processed out. But during periods of high flooding, the flow that goes into this wetlands is too much to handle. And there's separate channels built into this wetland, so when the flow gets too high, it doesn't destroy the wetland, it just gets diverted straight into the sink. That means though, that when there's high areas of flooding, that the contamination is going straight into the groundwater, which will later just be pumped out for drinking water.
Thank you, Jake. You're a good chief, good man we have on our team. I want to take a little bit of time and talk about our regulations and laws that we have in place to protect against pollutants getting into our wastewater in largely populated areas. Legal issues and historical context is important. Let me explain this a little bit. It was only as recent as 1980s that the United States began to implement some much needed regulations on stormwater. Relative to how long the United States has been around, this is really recent history. In 1948, the United States made its first ever attempt to protect water quality when Congress created the Water Pollution Control Act. Now, how does this relate to hurricanes? Well, it took some time, but they amended the act to account for stormwater in 1987. In this 1987 amendment made by the US Congress, places with populations greater than 100,000 were required to figure out ways to minimize pollutant storm discharges to the maximum extent practical. This rule, maximum extent practical, or MEP, was never really defined by the EPA, leaving municipalities to decide on their own what that means. Let's go ahead and cut the, can we go ahead and cut to our star reporter, Megan? She already interviewed Dee Hizzle earlier, did a great job on that. So let's go ahead and cut to Megan, and she's gonna talk a little bit about water quality during hurricanes.
Okay, thank you, Anchorman Raymond. Although this might not seem like it's that dangerous, there are some health issues tied to drinking water with these nutrients that can be dangerous. 2-H-phosphate, for example, can lead to kidney damage, while excess nitrates can be serious and possibly deadly to infants. There's just a few known contaminants going into our water, but there's also some non-point sources of contaminants that can come into our water, like motor oil, pesticides, and construction runoff that are not getting properly treated and going directly into groundwater that we use to drink.
Alright, now we're gonna go ahead and cut to Jake one last time. He has some closing words before we end this special report.
Just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, Gainesville has a Superfund site, Cabot Coppers, that is likely to discharge a lot of its infected sediment into the groundwater table during this major event. Because a lot of the contaminants at the Superfund site are embedded into the soil, the rainwater coming in is likely to pick up that soil and move it towards the Alachua County sink.
Thank you, Jake. Fine young man we have on the team. Fine young lad. Alright, well that concludes it for this special report. You're watching channel 4515 Scene News. This was a special report. Tune in for our regular programming at 5:10 p.m. to 6 p.m. on Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, and we'll be covering all sorts of weather patterns that affect wastewater plants. We're the #1 channel for that. Alright, Hurricane Adrian's on the way. You've heard it here first. This is a special report. We just wanted to warn you. So, stay safe and buy some bottled water.
Oh, fish paste! I'd best buy some bottled water.